Ready for a deep dive. Today we're tackling Hellenistic philosophy.
Stoics, Epicureans, Skeptics, they really went for the big questions back then.
And you know what? Their ideas still resonate. It's amazing.
Absolutely. We're still grappling with a lot of the same stuff. Knowledge, happiness, our place in the universe.
Exactly. And luckily we've got a fantastic guide for this deep dive. R.W. Sharples and his book, Stoics, Epicureans and Sceptics.
Great book. Dense, though.
That's why we're here, to break it down, make these ancient ideas relevant to us, today.
Yeah. Right. And Sharples does something really interesting right off the bat. He points out how different the Stoics and Epicureans were from earlier philosophers, like Plato.
Oh, how so?
Well, for Plato, knowledge was all about, like, these perfect forms, right,
Wow.
existing outside our world. But the Stoics and Epicureans, they were like, nope, knowledge starts with the senses.
With what we see, hear, touch.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a huge difference. It's like, where do you even begin to understand the world, if not from your own experiences?
And it totally changes how they see reality itself. Take the Epicureans, for example. They are all about atoms, everything made up of these tiny particles.
Okay, I've heard of that. But how does that even work?
Well, they believe that everything, even the soul, was made up of these tiny, indivisible bits.
So our feelings, thoughts, all just different arrangements of atoms.
That's what they thought. Wild, right? They even had this idea, Epicurus actually suggested there's this special type of atom, smaller and faster than all the rest. And it's responsible for, get this, for thought itself.
Whoa. Hold on. So they were trying to find the physical part of the brain that, creates consciousness back then.
They were way ahead of their time in some ways.
Me too.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is thought, really? Where does creativity come from, or imagination?
Free will, even. Big questions, right?
The Stoics had a different take on things. They believed in this thing called pneuma. It's like this divine breath, see, this spirit, and it flows through everything.
So everything's connected.
Everything. Your soul, for them, was like a little piece of this pneuma.
Instead of tiny atoms, it's like we're all plugged into one giant living universe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this difference, this whole soul thing, had a big impact on how they understood emotions.
Okay, so how does believing in atoms versus this pneuma,
Yeah.
how does that change how you see emotions?
Well, think about it. The Epicureans, right? Everything's physical. So emotions, those are just physical sensations too. Pleasure, pain, all that.
Makes sense, but the Stoics...
The Stoics thought emotions were judgments. It wasn't that you felt sad. It was that your mind decided the situation was sad.
So it's not just feeling it, it's how you think about it.
Exactly. And Sharples really stresses this Stoic belief that we can control our emotions through reason.
So you're not just, at the mercy of your feelings.
Not at all. You're a participant. You can choose how you respond.
That's a powerful concept. It's not about pretending we don't have emotions. It's about understanding where they come from and then, deciding what to do with them.
Right. And it gets at a major difference between these schools.
Yeah.
The whole idea of happiness.
Ah, yes. The age-old question.
Because you've got the Epicureans, right? All about pleasure, avoiding pain.
And the Stoics, saying virtue's the only true path to happiness.
Exactly. But Sharples makes a good point that is way more nuanced than that. For starters, Epicurus wasn't saying, just go wild and do whatever feels good.
It wasn't just instant gratification.
No way. It was about figuring out how to maximize pleasure over a whole lifetime, which actually requires some serious strategy. And, yes, even self-control.
So even for the pleasure seekers, it's not just about, giving into every impulse.
Not at all. Epicurus even came up with, this whole system. He divided desires into 3 categories.
Oh, what were they?
Natural and necessary. Those are the important ones. Then there were natural but unnecessary. And then the ones to really watch out for, unnatural desires.
Okay, I'm hooked. Give me an example. What would those look like in today's world?
Okay, well, take connection. We're social creatures, right? We need connection. It's natural and necessary.
Right.
But always needing validation from, say, social media.
Yeah.
That's more like a natural but unnecessary desire.
And probably leads to a lot of anxiety and unhappiness, I'd bet.
Exactly. You start chasing likes, followers, all that.
Yeah.
That's getting into those unnatural desires. The Epicureans would say those will never truly satisfy you.
Wow. Okay. That actually makes a lot of sense. It's like they're urging us to be more mindful about what we're really after.
Precisely. To figure out what truly brings lasting happiness, not just fleeting pleasure.
So fascinating. But what about the Stoics? If the Epicureans were all about pleasure, even in a strategic way, what was their take on, enjoying life? Was it all just virtue, virtue, virtue?
Well, here's the thing, and Sharples really emphasizes this. Stoic virtue wasn't about just gritting your teeth and bearing it,
Or suffering in silence.
Exactly. It was about aligning yourself with reason, with that divine spark inside you,
Yeah.
and accepting what you can't control.
So it's more about choosing how you react, not suppressing how you feel.
Yes. And they believed that true happiness, that came from living in accordance with nature, using that reason we've got, understanding our place in the grand scheme of things.
It's like saying focus on what you can control, your thoughts, your actions, but let go of the rest. It's a completely different way to think about peace and happiness than just like chasing good feelings like the Epicureans.
It is. And both schools of thought had some really specific ideas about how we should move through the world, especially when it comes to community.
Ah, yes. Community. That's where things get really interesting. Because you've got the Epicureans who seem to be all about keeping their circle small and supportive, creating those kind of ideal communities. And then the Stoics with their emphasis on universal citizenship. It's like these two totally different approaches to how we relate to each other.
And it all goes back to their core beliefs about happiness.
So we're back. And I'm still thinking about how both pleasure and virtue can lead to happiness. It's like two totally different paths, but maybe they end up at the same place.
It really makes you think about what happiness even is, right?
Right.
Like, is it about feeling good like the Epicureans believed? Or is it something about living a certain way, like the Stoics said?
And I wonder what the skeptics would say about all this. But before we get to all that questioning, I want to go back to how these philosophies played out in everyday life. Like, what about community? How did these schools of thought approach that whole idea of social responsibility?
That's a great question because you see a big difference there. Remember, the Epicureans were all about minimizing pain, maximizing pleasure, and that carried over into their social lives too. They often preferred to withdraw a bit, form communities with like-minded friends. It was about creating this supportive environment.
Like their own little utopia.
In a way, yeah. They wanted to find refuge from all the chaos and drama of the world. Cultivate happiness within their own carefully chosen circle.
But earlier, you mentioned that Epicurus thought friendships were based on mutual benefit. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, how much can they really care for others if it always comes back to their own, self-interest?
It's an interesting point. People have been debating that for centuries, really. Were the Epicureans just advocating for, like, selfishness disguised as friendship? Or were they saying, well, even when we help others, there's a part of us that feels good about it?
It makes you examine your own motivations, that's for sure.
For sure. And that's where the Stoic view is so different. Remember how they believed in cosmopolitanism? This idea that we're all citizens of the world.
Because we all share that same spark of reason.
Right. So instead of withdrawing, they were all about engaging with the world, fighting for justice, trying to understand each other. It was their duty to make things better, not just for their friends, but for everyone.
And that stemmed from their belief that everything's connected.
Exactly. They believe that everyone's suffering matters because, in a sense, it's all our suffering. We're all part of this one big web of existence.
That's really powerful, especially these days when it's so easy to feel overwhelmed by like all the problems in the world. It can feel so big. Did the Stoics offer any advice on how to, how to actually live that way with that global awareness?
They would say, focus on what you can control,
Yeah.
your own thoughts, actions, how you react. They really believed that by cultivating these virtues within ourselves, justice, wisdom, courage, that's how we create a better world.
So it's not about changing everything overnight. It's about focusing on your own growth and hoping it, has a ripple effect.
Right. It's recognizing our shared humanity, and acting with compassion, even when it's hard, even when we disagree.
Such an important message. But it brings us back to happiness. The Epicureans find it one way, the Stoics another. How can these completely opposite approaches both lead to the same place?
It's the question, isn't it? Maybe true happiness isn't about following one path perfectly, but finding a balance.
So, like a middle way. Combining the pursuit of pleasure with virtue, is that even possible?
It's a challenge, for sure. And that's where the skeptics come in. Because the Stoics are about reason and the Epicureans are all about pleasure. The skeptics, they're about questioning everything.
Even happiness itself.
Especially happiness itself. They want us to look at all our assumptions, everything we think we know, and ask, how do we know? We're sure about that.
So maybe by letting go of needing all the answers, we can find a different kind of peace.
Maybe. We'll find out after the break.
All right, so we've explored these different paths to happiness. We've talked about virtue with the Stoics, pleasure with the Epicureans.
And now, it's time for the skeptics. The ultimate questioners.
Right. The ones who say, hold on a minute, how do you even know what happiness is?
Exactly. They weren't about giving you a step-by-step guide or some grand theory. The skeptics, especially the Pyrrhonists, they were all about shaking things up, making you question everything you thought you knew.
So instead of saying this is the way to live, they're saying, how can you be so sure that's the right way to live?
Yes, they believed that by doubting, by letting go of the need to be right, that's where you find real peace. Because you're not clinging to ideas that might not even be true.
It's like they're saying the harder you search for happiness, the more it's going to slip through your fingers.
It's a paradox, right? But there's a freedom in that, because suddenly you're open to all these other possibilities.
So it's not about giving up entirely. It's just about being okay with not having all the answers.
And realizing that's okay. Sharples makes a really good point about this. He says the skeptics weren't trying to make everyone totally indecisive.
Or say that knowledge is impossible.
Right.
Yeah.
It was more about, humility, remembering we don't know everything.
That there's always more to learn. What you think is true today might not be true tomorrow.
And in a world where everyone's got an opinion, everyone thinks they have the answer, that kind of doubt is, I don't know, it's kind of refreshing, isn't it?
It's like a breath of fresh air. Because instead of clinging to our beliefs, we can be open to, maybe being wrong.
Or at least open to being wrong.
Yeah. Maybe there's a better way of seeing things.
Exactly. And that's where the skeptics can teach us something really valuable. They urge us to embrace uncertainty.
Because that's just part of life, isn't it?
It is. And by accepting that, by becoming more comfortable with, I don't know, we can actually become more adaptable, more resilient even.
We're not so attached to things being a certain way, so when things change, we can roll with it.
Exactly. It's like, remember that old saying, the only constant is change? Well, the skeptics, they get that.
Bring on the change, we're ready.
And maybe, just maybe, by letting go of the need for certainty, we can actually find our own unique path to happiness.
One that we haven't even imagined yet.
Exactly. It's a journey. And the skeptics remind us that it's okay to enjoy the journey, even if we don't know exactly where we're going.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive. We've journeyed through Stoicism with its focus on virtue and Epicureanism with its emphasis on pleasure. And we ended with skepticism, those champions of doubt, urging us to question everything and embrace the unknown.
It's incredible, isn't it, how these ancient philosophies still speak to us today, offering wisdom and different ways of seeing the world.
They've given us these different lenses and we can choose which ones to look through, or maybe even try to combine them and see what happens.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you and never being afraid to keep questioning, keep exploring.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive, but keep those philosophical conversations going because you never know where they might lead you. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time.